story which may seem like a long story, but it's the story of the Noongar countryside from Geraldton to Merredin to Esperance. And this ancient creation time, the dreaming or the Dreamtime, some people say was the beginning of time. But my father first heard this story of the southwest from his uncle, whose name was Thomas. And everybody referred to Uncle Thomas as a Maban man. The word Maban meant magic. And when Uncle Thomas would come and visit, this man, he would just appear out of nowhere. When it was time for him to leave, though, like in the movies, turn back, he's nowhere to be seen. But Uncle Thomas could play any musical instrument you put near him. He was a person of pure talents, and he never lost a game of cards. But this man was never caught up by greed or modern-day society. He preferred to live out in the bush. But every time he did come to town, he would always sit my father and his brothers and sisters around a fire at night, and he would tell them the story of creation. But Uncle Thomas did not use the modern-day terms of the dreaming or the dream time. He used an ancient word. He called this time the knitting, and knitting meant very cold time. During this time, it was said the land was flat, the land was featureless, the sky sat heavily pressed against the earth, and it was the heavy sky that stopped reality from appearing. But all of the beings that are here on the land today, they were present back during the dream time, but back then, absolutely everything was in its spirit form, and there were spirits of all kinds. There were tree spirits, animal spirits, bird spirits, people spirits, even spirits of beings we don't see here today were present. But all of these beings knew one day the heavy sky, it would lift, reality, it would appear, and everything would have its place and a purpose. And after a very lengthy elimination process, all the beings realised somebody would need to look after everything when everything did become real. And of course it was the humans, it was agreed, were the only ones able or capable of caring for everything. But in the dreaming, it was the trees who first approached the people, and they said, when everything does become real, as trees we will only ever grow in one place. We can't look after very much, so we trees, we want you people to look after us. In return, we will give you everything we can. Our berries, our fruit, our branches, our root systems, our trunks. Whatever you need from us, the trees, you're more than welcome to take. There's just one condition. Please, do not take the trees until such time as there are no trees left. The animal spirits, they said, that sounds fair. We want the same deal with you people. Take our fur, our meat, our bones, look after us, but don't take us till there's none of us left either. The birds, all of the other beings pledged to the people. The people would be the rightful carers of everything. And from the first condensed part of this story, we see a very strong message of a modern-day word, sustainability. Only take what you need and look after everything around. But as time went by in this particular story, there was one giant spirit being that sat there listening to all of this. He was one of the larger, more powerful spirits, and the more he listened, the more he could hear. Throughout the darkness in the distance, some simple spirits were arguing over what they're going to look like, where they're going to be, what they're going to become. And this giant spirit being knew, if the arguing was to spread across the entire countryside, when everything did become real, there may be too much turmoil or unrest in the world. He wanted to stop this arguing, and the more he listened, the more fed up he got. And eventually this giant spirit being got to the point where he could no longer tolerate the arguing. He just snapped. He used all of his energy in an effort to lift that heavy sky. This spirit being was nowhere near strong enough to lift the sky all the way up, but he was strong enough to lift the sky around himself. And the only form this being could take shape of was that of a being made up of many bones and many muscles, a gigantic snake. A gigantic serpent was the first real being, and in the language here we call that being Waggle. Some people say Woggle, others say Waggal. We're talking different dialects of the south. But I'm talking about a creation being that appears universally in stories all around Australia. It's referred to in the modern day as the rainbow serpent. And if you could imagine a giant snake materializing from the darkness, all of the other spirits, they stood in awe. They now had a leader, but paying very close attention, now that the being had become real, were our two human spirits. Some people called them Charnock, which meant very tall. But there was one male and one female, and the spirit woman stood tall with flowing long white hair running down her back. And as Waggle the giant serpent was creating our major waterway, the beautiful Swan River, it was the spirit woman that noticed everything under the snake was real, everything above was not. And the burning question in her mind was, what would happen if I placed my foot under that snake's tail. And as soon as she did this, her foot became real. She trod on the ground for the very first time. But as soon as she took that foot back away, it turned back into its spirit form. But in the Swan River today, we say the footprint still remains. There's a magical set of cliffs on the southern shores called Black Wall Reach. It's 28 metres to swim to the bottom and grab a handful of sand. Nannap is the name. Janna means your foot. The suffix up, place of the footprint. And right next to that footprint, a strand of her long white hair fell, laying across the valley, marking out the sandbar of Point Walter. And that is why our women and children gathered at that area. But in this culture there's a men's side and a women's side. I cannot tell you any more about that place. Only the women could tell you. And you'd have to ask them. Us men, we're not allowed to know. But what I can tell you all in this story, the spirit man, he began to show several other human qualities. He became bored and he became impatient. And the last glimpse she saw of him, he was disappearing into the darkness to the south. Last spotted, collecting things and eating them. She took really no notice. The spirit woman travelled north, following the Wargle, the giant serpent, as it created the other waterways, just like Star Swan. But as this spirit woman travelled north, she too became distracted. She began to notice that staring back at her from the darkness all around, from everywhere, were lots of little pairs of blinking eyes. Curiosity got the better of her again. She decided to collect one of these beings, and as she brought this being close to her face, she could see in the palm of her hand was now something very beautiful. She had just collected from the land a small spirit child. And that is when our greatest human quality of all came into play. That is emotion. Due to emotion, she could not put the child back. She wanted to keep it. So she placed the small spirit child she collected from the land in her long white hair. The child held on and she travelled north, collecting more upon more of these children, putting them all in her hair. Hundreds upon thousands to start. But as time began to elude her, she became obsessed with collecting these children, and she collected millions upon billions more of these small spirit children, putting them in this long white hair of hers as she travelled north and then east away from Perth. But she did reach a point east where she stopped, and something triggered in her mind that maybe it was wrong of her to take these children from the land without knowing what they're for. So she asked the land itself. The name of this land is Budjar. She said, Budjar, what is the purpose of the children? And the land simply told her, when the heavy sky does lift and reality appears, when a human child's born on this land, we say that the person will be born with one of these spirit children. It will be the person's connection to the countryside where they belong, their connection to a marriage system, a totem system, even a connection to the spiritual world, once they're old enough to understand how that works. So she knew she'd made a mistake. She had to put all these children back. But then something else triggered in her mind, and that was the last glimpse she saw of the spirit man. He was collecting things and eating them. And as soon as she thought back to that moment, she stopped dead in her tracks. She realised the only thing he could have been eating were those children. And once she realised this, all she could do was stand there, shaking and trembling. The old people say she was so upset, she transferred that trembling into the ground where she stood. If we were all to jump in a car and head 130 kilometres east of Perth, we would come across a small town called Meckering. And in 1968, if you Google that town, you'll see they had an earthquake. It was 6.9 on the Richter scale. It's a big earthquake for anywhere, let alone here in Australia. But science did become interested. They set up seismic readers around the town, and sure enough, they found a fault line. But it wasn't until years later, of looking back through all their data, they came to the conclusion there are over 300 tremors each year around that little town. So to modern day science, Meckering, the most unstable piece of land in the southwest, to the old Aboriginal people that know that land well, it's the land that always moves, as a reminder of this major human mistake. But from that point in the countryside, once she composed herself, the spirit woman knew she must stop that spirit man. So she ran south to try and find him. She could always put the children back later, but as she ran south, she passed many more children she had not collected. Our word in the language here for child is Koolunga. The Koolungas on the ground looked up. They could see the Koolungas in her hair, and they knew we have to get them back somehow. It was the Koolungas on the ground that turned themselves into the spirit bird that represents children. Coolbardie. Coolbardie is the magpie. I'll simply ask the group now, has anyone here ever been attacked by a magpie before? They dive bomb you, they pick at your hair. We say they've been doing that since the beginning of time. That's exactly what the birds in the story did. They flew up, picking the children from her hair and dropping them back to the ground. But as the child fell, it went through the heavy sky. It hit the land and it turned to stone. Not a small stone, but by today's standard, a giant granite boulder, a giant granite outcrop, or a monolith, as some people call these stones. But running south from that town site of Meckering, across the country, there's a giant series of these giant granite boulders. Boygen Rock, Gillikin Rock, Kokobin Rock, Yorkracone Rock, Bruce Rock. The stones continue to the central stone, which we call Katakich. Katakich is wave rock, that giant surfing wave frozen in stone. It just happens to be the central stone, right in the middle of Nyungar land. And this is where she stood looking for that spirit man. She could not see him anywhere. In one last effort, she ran south to try and find him. The birds, building in numbers, constantly bombarding her. And in this dazed and confused state, she ran straight back to Wave Rock. And as she ran back to this stone, she jumped onto the stone and she sprung upwards above the sky, where she realised she had now made two very big mistakes. Mistake number one, she had trapped herself above the sky's level. She could no longer connect back to the earth. But even worse than that, no fault of their own, all of the children in her long white hair were now trapped in that sky as well. She promised those children somehow, some way, she will right the wrong and she will send them back to the land where they belong. But in the meantime, she teaches them all the knowledge they need to know about living on this land while they're up in the sky with her. But of course, much time has now passed. This planet has been real for millions, if not billions of years. Everything is living, everything is evolving. But as humans today, we are clearly going against those ancient rules of living here. We are destroying this environment. But when we, the people of the South, turn to the stars at night, there's a long white mass that runs through that southern sky we all call the Milky Way. We call the Milky Way Jundal. Jundal means long white hair. It's all you can see of her. The children she collected, all those little stars up in the Milky Way. But every now and then, as promised, she does send them back. And if we're lucky enough to see a shooting star at night, or a meteor, the old people here would always say the words, Bwai Kolanganyina. And Bwai Kolanganyina means spirit child, returning back to the earth. So it is a beautiful little story. But believe it or not, that's a very short version of what is a very, very long story. My father takes 1 hour to tell that version. We don't have that kind of time today, but if he goes out into the bush following those stones, sometimes it's a 3-day trip to get a basic level of understanding. But he did go out there a few years ago with some very senior spiritual people. They were all senior American shamans. That group of people took 8 days to get through that story. The more you know, the more you understand, the more you're allowed to know. It's an interesting way of sharing information. But that is the story of this countryside, from Geraldton to Merredin to Esperance. Glad I could tell it to you while we're here. But also while we're here, I've got a few items behind me which I'm going to pass around and explain a few uses for.